Our text is 1 Corinthians chapter 2, the first 16 verses. And it will be up on the screen for you, or if you have a Bible or a device that brings you to the Bible, you want to follow along, I'm going to start by reading the text. 1 Corinthians 2, verses 1 through 16. And I, when I came to you, brothers, did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom. For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. And I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling. And my speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstrations of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. Yet among the mature we do impart wisdom, although it is not a wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age, who are doomed to pass away. But we impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glory. None of the rulers of this age understood this, for had they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. But as it is written, what no eye has seen, no ear heard, nor the heart of man imagined, what God has prepared for those who love Him. These things God has revealed to us through the Spirit. For the Spirit searches everything, even the depths of God. For who knows a person's thoughts except the spirit of that person, which is in him? So also no one comprehends the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we might understand the things freely given us by God. And we impart this in words, not taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, interpreting spiritual truths to those who are spiritual. The natural man does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him, and he is not able to understand them because they are spiritually discerned. The spiritual person judges all things, but is himself to be judged by no one. For who has understood the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ. In July 2013, the Oxford Journal of Legal Studies published an article called Rape Myths: Is Elite Opinion Right or Popular Opinion Wrong? Is elite opinion right and popular opinion wrong? By scholar Helen Rees. In the paper, Rees notes the lack of success that extensive legal reforms have had on increasing the number of rape convictions in England and Wales, the current conviction rate being only 7%. In particular, she pushes back on feminist scholars who argue that the root cause of this forensic ineffectiveness is the justice system's implicit bias toward rape victims, most of whom are women. In fact, what has become the consensus among British legal experts, it seems, is that the great disparity between the rate of reporting and the rate of conviction is the result of a male-dominated, master cultural narrative that perpetuates certain myths about rape. False beliefs that render the justice system blind to the criminality which is ubiquitous, making it impossible for it to recognize that there is, in fact, a rape culture in Europe. Myths such as the belief that women sometimes cry rape in order to get attention, or that unlike other crimes, rape victims at times bear some responsibility for the illicit encounter because they dressed too provocatively or sent other misleading nonverbal cues, and many other biases which obscure victimization, supposedly. It is even argued that victims themselves can have an internalized form of this bias, an embracing of these myths that is so deep that it is even impossible for them to realize that they have been victimized. It's impossible for them to know that they've been raped. Using sound argumentation supported by empirical evidence, Rees's article demonstrates that these myths are in fact a myth. That first of all, many of them are actually true statements and not false, and that even for those that are false, few people in Britain actually believe them, and that throughout the criminal justice system, the proportion of reported crimes that end in conviction is usually small, that there is no good evidence that the justice system is less likely to acknowledge rape than any other crime, meaning that this prominent explanatory theory has scant evidential support and should therefore be discarded. Now, rather than her paper being received with appreciation for its significant contribution to the collective pursuit of truth, Rees's work was condemned, and demands to ban her from every public platform quickly followed. The main criticism of Rees's findings came from feminist scholars J. Conaghan and Y. Russell. And the primary critique of their 35-page rejoinder is that Rees framed her assessment in terms of objective truth. Conaghan and Russell were disturbed that Rees debunked feminist scholarship by, quote, reducing it to questions of empirical fact, close quote. And that, quote, this is done through the use of an analysis contained by dichotomized concepts like truth and falsity, and sameness and difference, close quote. In other words, for Conaghan and Russell, these discussions on the prevalence of rape need to be set free from such black and white categories as truth and falsity because they are too reductionistic. So it was Rees's appeal to objectivity that so annoyed these feminists. They were outraged that, quote, Rees comes across as a voice of common sense by appealing to scientific facts and hard evidence. Conaghan and Russell sum up their critique this way, quote, Rees's analysis is thus wholly reliant upon a liberal model of the self-possessing autonomous legal subject, a model which has been exhaustively critiqued by feminists and other critical scholars, close quote. This distinction between liberal and critical is an important one that we're going to come back to. Now, in response to Rees's criticisms, Conaghan and Russell retort that the reason why these obfuscating myths concerning rape, these myths that make it impossible for the justice system to see it taking place, the reason why you can't find them anywhere is because they are actually unconscious, and therefore they can't be tested. People don't even know that they hold these beliefs, which of course seems rather a convenient explanation. And as many feminist scholars have noted, the reason that we know that these myths exist is because the victims, due to their victimhood, have been awakened to the falsity of these master narratives. The attack itself has shaken them from their misogynistic slumber, and they now see clearly the widespread oppression of women that everyone else is blind to. Now, you'll notice this, and if we were to keep reading from this kind of material, you notice how much borrowing of Christian symbolism takes place in feminist literature, like this idea of awakening, of a rising from one's dogmatic slumber. This is religious appropriation, we might say, of the very worst kind. What it's trying to do is exploiting the appeal of the biblical narrative, but only to do so to lead lost travelers into greater darkness, which is to say that what we're dealing with here is another religion, and in fact, it's one that's rooted in Christianity, so we might call it a heretical form of Christianity even. But because these victims have seen the glitch in the matrix, the idea is, their testimony then is to be given maximum credibility. They have been able to go outside Plato's cave and are now equipped to come back in and enlighten the rest of us. Victims then, at least in the stronger versions of this view, victims are to be believed automatically. Hence, the Believe All Women slogan of the Me Too movement, the mindset that undergirded the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation debacle from a few years ago. Unfortunately for Western civilization, such muddled thinking has not been confined to the issue of rape or even feminist studies, as if that wouldn't be bad enough. No, this noetic epidemic has spread faster than the coronavirus. It pops up in every field of academic inquiry that is created, like race studies and gender studies and sexuality studies and post-colonial studies and pretty much anything that has the word studies attached to it. If you're planning on going to college soon and you're thinking, hey, religious studies sounds like a good idea, or gender studies, know that it's not a good idea. They've, in fact, taken over the liberal arts departments of almost every university. They dominate it. And with the death of George Floyd, this woke virus has escaped the lab of academia and has been released into the general population. Indeed, even the Georgetown Public Library has tested positive for it. Or as Andrew Sullivan has said, we are all in gender studies now. Although like COVID-19, it seems to me that our culture has been infected actually for a long time now. We were just asymptomatic. In fact, we might say that due to our culture's current identity crisis that we are facing, an identity crisis that we've talked about before, a crisis in meaning and value, which I think comes from this sort of constructivist project that we've been on, this sort of sovereign self of trying to determine ultimate meaning and purpose and value for our lives ourselves, right? What we've been calling, along with Robert, from Robert Bellas, this idea of expressive individualism, where I just look inside my heart and determine what my true desires are and then have the courage to express those desires. That kind of constructivist approach to identity formation is of course impotent. And it's led to this identity crisis that we are seeing in our culture. And so you might say that many of us have an underlying spiritual condition which makes this ideological disease much more dangerous for us. Now, because this virus has reached pandemic proportions, it's infiltrated all of our cultural institutions, the media, entertainment, education, the church, on and on we go. It seems prudent to take the time to explore some of its philosophical foundations, to examine its pathology, if you will, and then to provide the cure for it, or at least a vaccine for those who have yet to be infected, or maybe just a mask to put on for the time being to slow the spread of the disease. Now, due to the complexity of this subject, it seems best to break it up into pieces. The first concerns the movement's epistemology, what is often called standpoint epistemology, a discussion for which the opening illustration that I used, that was designed to prepare us, to lay the groundwork, if you will, for this discussion. Now, the word epistemology sounds very technical, but it's pretty straightforward. Within the domain of philosophy, epistemology concerns itself with knowledge. It's about developing a theory of knowledge, in particular asking the question, one, what constitutes knowledge? And then secondly, how do we go about knowing anything? How do we go about obtaining that kind of knowledge? And so standpoint epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge that undergirds this broader ideology, is rooted in the writings of 18th century German philosopher George Hegel and what he called the master-slave dialectic. And I think this will sound familiar to you. Roughly, Hegel argued that society can be broken down into two groups, masters and slaves. A dichotomy which, by the way, will prove very useful for people that come after Hegel, like Karl Marx and Friedrich Nietzsche. But the slave, who obviously represents the oppressed or marginalized class, has a kind of insight on society, Hegel thinks. A consciousness, we might say, a self-consciousness or a double consciousness, because while the master is living in the master's world, in which he believes that his is the only point of view, you can kind of think of a massive narcissist in which he thinks he's the center of the universe, the slave, who also lives in that world, being subordinate to the master, knows all too well that there exists another point of view from his own, namely the master's point of view. This awareness that there exists more than one point of view provides the slave with an insight into society. That insight, as understood by feminists many, many, many years later, scholars like Sandra Harding, is that the oppressed have the ability to see both oppression and the systems which are responsible for it in a truer light than those who are privileged, which is to say that those who are the masters, those who dominate, the oppressors. In a stronger version of this theory, which tends to be the one that has been popularized, it is only the oppressed who can have this insight, while everyone else at best is left to the role of advocate. This is why it is often said that only victims can speak with credibility concerning the issue of rape, while all others must remain silent. Or why only black people can speak with authority to the issue of race, while white people must check their privilege. And when this is mixed with postmodernism, even appeals to empirical evidence and compelling logical arguments can't subvert this subjective insight. Not even appeals to revelation can do it. It is indefeasible. It can't be defeated. At least that's true in the strong version of standpoint theory. Now, there's a couple of clarifications that I want to make this morning, and as I do that, I'm going to make a few criticisms of the theory in general. Remember, this is just sort of part one of several lessons on the broader ideology, although I probably won't do them all in a row. I'll sort of scatter them out over the next coming months. By using the word standpoint, this approach is not simply making the observation that everyone has a point of view, or even that the knowledge that comes from understanding that truth, that everyone has a point of view, is a good thing, which it is. As finite beings fixed in time and space, none of us stand at the Archimedean point, as people like to say. If you remember Archimedes, he supposedly said that if you give me a lever big enough, I'll move the entire earth. But the question then would be, well, where would you stand in order to move the lever? And so that's become an expression for a place from which we can objectively perceive reality with a view of totality. This is the God's eye view of the universe. Nobody has a God's eye view of the universe. No human being does, besides from Jesus. But we all, in other words, observe reality from somewhere. And it's not just our observation, which is biased, if we want to use that word, although I think it's too loaded, but also our thinking. For our thinking also occurs within a particular context. And that context then has an effect upon it, and we've talked about this before. But to make matters worse than that, what Christianity teaches us is that our ability to observe and to think is also marred by our fallenness. That while we may claim to be wise, as the text in 1 Corinthians tells us, our sin ensures that we are fools. And this is true even for those of us who have been regenerated, those for whom the imagination has been sanctified and reason baptized. The old man still routinely shows up and demonstrates to everyone just how stupid we can be. So this is why revelation and the illuminating work of the Spirit are both necessary. God, of course, does have a God's eye view of the universe, and He has richly blessed us by revealing such truth to us in His Word. And the Spirit works to allow us to see and understand this particular truth. So here's the thing. Christians actually do have a privileged position from which to understand the cosmos. We have been given the mind of Christ, as Paul says here in our text in verse 16. What the Spirit teaches us is what comes from Christ's mind. Interestingly, standpoint epistemology also purports to offer this God's eye view of the world. It also claims, at least implicitly, that it has a privileged position, but one which is not grounded in divine revelation and not taught by spiritual illumination. In other words, while standpoint theorists wish to distance themselves from appeals to this kind of objectivity, as we saw with the critique of the paper we talked about at the beginning, the theory does present a meta-narrative, a grand explanation of what constitutes knowledge and how we come to know it. So for all of its desire to deconstruct the oppressive master narrative, what the theory really aims to do is replace the current dominant epistemology with its own. And if successful, standpoint theory would then occupy the position of the oppressor, which is quite ironic. It's this idea of, oh, I want to set you free, but I only want to set you free so that I can then rule over you, which seems to me maybe disingenuous at first, but then when you think about it from the Christian point of view, the Bible clearly says we're slaves no matter what. You don't get to choose whether or not you're a slave. As Bob Dylan said, you're going to have to serve somebody, right? It might be the devil, it might be the Lord, but we were designed to be slaves for servitude. The only choice you get to make is who your master is going to be. And that's what standpoint theory wants to do. It wants to be the dominant view. Now notice I'm speaking in very broad terms. I'm speaking of the theory as a whole. But think about this. In a harmonious society, one theory of knowledge is going to have dominion. You can't have a whole bunch of different ones operating in all of the cultural institutions. There's going to be one that dominates. Because only one can serve as the foundation for making laws. And only one can serve as a foundation for forming and guiding institutions. Think about this. What is the current epistemology which guides the public school system? Well, it's certainly not, well, there's a different one in every single school, unless we want to nuance this down to the point of the ridiculous. There is one, and the Department of Education and state agencies ensure that that one is to be applied across the board. And I'll tell you this, it's certainly not one which recognizes Scripture as authoritative. So standpoint epistemology, just like Christian epistemology, aims to unseat the current, what we might call the 19th century Enlightenment view, which is fading fast. But both of these views, the 19th century Enlightenment view and standpoint epistemology, are highly influenced by Christianity, as I said. I mean, this idea of victimhood being a position of power only makes sense in a society which has been deeply influenced by the cross. Right? This ideology wouldn't get off the ground at all during the Greco-Roman period. I mean, the cross was nonsense to Romans, and this view would be as well. So this is, as I said, it's a version of Christianity in a sense, and it's a heretical one. And so it seems to me that there is a deep incoherence with regards to the approach itself. And really, this is a deep incoherence which characterizes all of the present forms of postmodernism. It's sort of the applying of postmodernism. It's the same objection I had when we talked about pluralism. Pluralism says no one religion has the complete truth, except the pluralist who's telling everyone that you don't have a version of the complete truth. It's incoherent. And this is something, by the way, that the original postmodernists understood, like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida and the rest of them. On some level, they understood that their view was incoherent, and they just embraced the incoherence. I mean, it's a very depressed sort of philosophy. It's sort of rooted in resentment, really, at the failure of the views that had come before them. They knew, to be consistent, they'd have to deconstruct their own view, too, and you're just left with sort of this dark abyss of nothingness, meaninglessness. In standpoint theory, however, there is an objective perspective being presented, that the marginalized are the ones in the privileged epistemic position, that they alone are privy to the true truth, while the rest of us are not. But here's another question. How did the standpoint theorist come to this knowledge? From where did she derive this theory? Was it through reasoning? Or observation, or through revelation? In other words, the very epistemic tools that she wishes to deny lead to objectivity. The very kind of sweeping statements that they so despise is the very kind of statement that they are making. Which, by the way, just as an aside, but you've probably seen this where people are saying that math is oppressive, right? Like, how in the world? I'm sure you think that just makes absolutely no sense at all. Let me just try to explain that for a second based on what we've already said. But this is what's known as epistemic oppression, right? Get rid of objectivity, get out of your mind, And so then science and reason just become different ways of coming to certain kinds of knowledge, not objective knowledge, just kinds of knowledge. And so you can't really privilege any one approach to knowledge then. And so what the idea is that in this Eurocentric world that we're in, this Eurocentric culture, what we've done is we've taken science and reason and we've exalted them and said that those are the only ways in which you can come to know knowledge. Now, some of that is actually true. I mean, for quite a while, as I said, sort of this 19th century Enlightenment forward, with things like logical positivism and other approaches to epistemology, people just said essentially science is the ultimate arbiter of truth and everything else is nonsense. I mean, there was some real extreme views, but this says, that none of those things are objective, and so we have, placed some as more important, and unfortunately some people aren't good at math, I guess, which is true, I'm not good at math, but some people aren't good at math, and so it's oppressive to the people who aren't good at math because we're saying that math is important, but these other kinds of coming to knowledge are less important. We prioritized them. The weird part about this, though, is that the group that's supposedly struggling with this are all minorities, which seems to suggest that minorities aren't good at math or science, which reminds me of what the Klan used to say, back in the day, but that's neither here nor there. This is epistemic oppression, it's called, and it's rooted in this particular theory. So here's the thing. Christians should heartily agree that one must exercise a level of epistemological humility, we might say. Okay? And we must also affirm what philosophers call perspectival knowledge, like knowledge from a perspective. A victim of rape does have a unique kind of knowledge. There's no doubt about it. The knowledge of what it's like to be raped. It's horrible, but it is a kind of insight. And those who are not victims should not presume to know what it's like. That is offensive. This special knowledge is to be respected, and it deserves a seat at the table when the existence of rape culture is debated. But it's not a knowledge which speaks immediately to whether or not there is a rape culture, or as to whether or not the justice system is systemically biased toward rape victims. Or to put it another way, it's a piece of evidence, but it's not the only piece of evidence, or the piece of evidence that is to be the most privileged. Secondly, it's not beyond scrutiny. For such perspectival knowledge is also informed by the many other biases which this person holds. Right? It's not just they have one perspective and that's it. They have all these other beliefs that they have that influence it, like how they define rape. Where do you draw the line? Feminist scholars tend to privilege women who hold to the same definition of rape as they do. Right? Those are the women who can see through the master narrative. But the women who have a different definition cannot. They're the ones with the internalized bias. So part of me wants to say, why don't we just sort of get rid of all the pretense and set aside all of the postmodern mumbo-jumbo, and why don't you just put forward your argument for a broader definition of rape? Because that seems to me to be a legitimate question. It's a legitimate topic. Where do we draw the line? That's a conversation we should have as a society. But here's the thing, though. Here's the problem with that, and I think perhaps part of the reason why they don't just do that. It's because if we don't share the same foundations, then the debate will be interminable. It will just go on and on and on, and it will never get anywhere. If we have radically different values, then the conversation is dead on arrival, and I'm afraid that's the issue. In other words, what we're talking about when we say, how do we define rape, is we are applying ethics. Okay? In order to apply ethics, you actually have to have a system of ethics. You have to have that foundation. And if we radically disagree in terms of value, then the only conversation we can have is concerns the actual foundation itself, right? Back and forth. That's it. If you get up above that and say, how do we apply it, that conversation is going nowhere. So overall, my critique of standpoint epistemology is that it's too limited of a view. And here's the thing. I think it came about in response to other extreme theories of knowledge that I mentioned a moment ago. Theories which gave no consideration at all to the perspective of the knower. And this is what I think Conaghan and Russell meant by their distinction between liberal and critical. Liberal in their mind is roughly equivalent to the Enlightenment view, which said, and I'm generalizing, that knowledge is subject neutral, period. That you don't come to the data from any particular point of view, not if you're doing it right. That reason and science can provide us a God's eye view of reality. But as I said, I think that's actually false. I think we do come to all this data from a point of view. And I think that that position that says we don't has a thinness to it that led to some of the resentment of postmodernism and sort of the giving up and then just wanting to destroy every other worldview that you see in it. And so in response to that, I think postmodernism in general, standpoint theory in specific, went to the other extreme, where knowledge becomes purely subjective, where there is only your point of view, and that's it. So one view privileges reason, the other experiential knowledge, or what they would call lived experience. Now that historical explanation is rough and likely needs major nuance, but I'm just offering it sort of as a heuristic device, as a way of just trying to clarify the differences between these views. And here's the thing, the advantage of Christian epistemology is that it contains all of these kinds of knowing. Although, of course, it privileges revelation. But here's the thing, its revelation is understood through perspectival knowledge, through the illuminating work of the Holy Spirit. That's what this text in 1 Corinthians is telling us. Because the things of God must be spiritually discerned. Or it says as it says in Proverbs, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. There is a point of view from which the deepest truths of the universe can be known, can be learned. The secret and hidden wisdom of God, as Paul refers to it in this text. There is an enlightened perspective, in other words. But awakening to it doesn't come from you being victimized, but by someone else experiencing that violence in your place. Christians do have a privileged position, as I said, from which to understand the cosmos, the point of view of the redeemed, of the regenerate. We are given the mind of Christ so that we can judge all things, says Paul, and yet not be judged ourselves. This is why the natural man does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him. The scales have to first fall from his eyes before he can see it. And this, mind you, is not an identity that's wrapped in victimhood, but rather in victory. It's not of pitting one race against another, but having the unity of one holy nation, a people of God's own possession. This is a truth that doesn't enslave you, but it sets you free. So there are these two extreme views, and I think they're both reductionistic. They're sort of like the wayward children of Christianity, the prodigal son and the elder brother, and they need to be reconciled. In fact, I think our nation's future depends upon a reconciliation of these two. The Enlightenment view has had its day in the sun, and it's proved wanting, and it's given birth to this nightmare of an approach that needs to be put down, or maybe I should say incorporated in to the Christian view. Because as I said, these are heresies. These are Christian heresies. What we're doing now is the same thing they did when it came to all the great councils of the church. In fact, I think we should hold one here and invite everybody to come, right? 3rd, 4th century, these heresies would rear their ugly heads and threaten everything, and people of faith had to stand up and argue them down and say, no, that is not true Christianity. Well, a new heresy has reared its ugly head, and we have to speak out against it. And that's best, this reconciliation, I think, is best done through the Christian view of epistemology.